This video is sponsored by Masterworks. When I put a poll on Twitter asking whose idea was the GM bailout, 60% said it were the Democrats because they knew President Obama pushed for the bailout and made it happen. And 30% thought it were the Republicans because they knew that President George W. Bush started the bailout talks and passed it along to Obama. But the truth is, they're both wrong because the bailout was General Motors' idea. After bringing itself to the brink of bankruptcy, GM found a way to shed all of their debt off, and they had lawmakers on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, working for them to make the bailout happen. If you think this sounds like some crazy conspiracy theory, you're right, only it's real, and I've got proof. In this video, I will show a smoking gun testimony from the very guy who made it happen. Trust me, the truth is wilder than you imagined. And what's worse, there are signs of this happening again shortly. Hey guys, welcome to Connecting the Dots, the podcast where we follow the breadcrumbs and try to predict where disruptions will take us. I recently made a video series that went viral about General Motors figuratively selling America. In the first video, I showed how GM transferred its most advanced technologies to its Chinese partner, SAIC. In the second video, I showed how GM planned to move most of its car production and all of its EV production to China, and planned to import Chinese cars to the United States. If it weren't for import tariffs being set up, American roads would now be filled with Chinese Cadillacs, Buicks, and Chevrolets. In the third video, I showed how to this day, GM is still taking billions of dollars of taxpayer money, yet always fails to show loyalty in return. And in the fourth, bonus video, I showed that the union didn't object to GM's plans, because the union became GM's largest shareholder. This formed a conflict of interest, in which the union profits more from GM moving production abroad and hiring temporary workers than from protecting workers' rights. If you haven't watched the videos, there's a link in the card above, but no need to watch it for this video. This one is different. As one of my viewers, CB, put it, GM turned into a quasi-nationalized company, in which their profits are kept, but their losses are socialized and charged to taxpayers in the form of bailouts and subsidies. I finished the series and went back to doing what I love, such as talking about disruptions, Elon, and Tesla. But when tidying up my folders, I opened an article I previously had not opened, and what I read there blew my mind. This article contained something I didn't expect to find, a detailed smoking gun report on how GM was the one who arranged the bailout, and then got politicians on both sides to support it. What's more, this report was given by no other than the man who arranged it for GM. In this video, I will present this testimony and provide little-known facts on what actually happened behind the scenes. I will give my opinion on the article, the bailout, and how things panned out. I'll show GM's current situation and why a new bailout will possibly occur in the upcoming years. And I'll finish off by discussing whether a second bailout should be provided, and if so, on which terms. And after all is said and done, I'll drop a huge bomb into the room with new info on a much larger scale. You see, this video shows how politicians from left and from right were pawns in GM's game. But while finalizing this video, I discovered GM itself was a pawn. We all are, in a much larger game. A huge thank you to my amazing patrons. I'm doing this by myself, and I truly appreciate your support. Click the link in the corner to support the channel, and you'll also get my Patreon-only newsletter, where I analyze recent events to see how they'll affect companies and investments. And if you haven't done that already, please subscribe to the channel and smash the like button to support it. It really helps the channel. Now buckle up and get ready, because we're in for a wild ride. It's about power, money, and politics, and about corporations and politicians playing with taxpayer money as if it's their own. One thing I promise you is it won't be boring. The article's name is How General Motors Was Really Saved: The Untold True Story of the Most Important Bankruptcy in U.S. History by Alix. And let's start with the editor's note by Dan Bigman of Forbes magazine. Lots of people, including President Obama, have trumpeted their role in the success of the government-backed turnaround plan that saved General Motors, the most important industrial company in the history of the United States. But on the 5th anniversary of the crisis, Forbes presents an exclusive, unprecedented look at what really happened during GM's darkest days, how a tiny band of corporate outsiders and turnaround experts convened in Detroit and hatched a radical plan that ultimately set the foundation for the salvation of the company. Author Alix one of the most respected experts on corporate bankruptcy in America, was the architect of that plan. And now, for the first time, he reveals how General Motors was really saved. Pausing here for a moment before we hear what Alix has to say, I promised you a smoking gun, so you might ask yourself, why in the world would Alix or anyone else provide it? And the reason is that success has many fathers. In the years after the bailout, it was considered a huge success, and Alix, like Obama and many others, wanted to take credit for his part in structuring the deal. I will give my opinion regarding the bailout after we go through Jay's testimony. But for now, I'll just say that I think that the bailout was important for preventing the collapse of the American automotive industry, especially second and third tier suppliers. But it should have been done very, very, very differently. We'll discuss this later, but for now, let's hear what Jay has to say. Jay Alix is the founder of Alix Partners, a financial advisory and global consulting firm, best known for its work in the turnaround space. The firm has advised on some of the largest Chapter 11 reorganizations in history, including General Motors, Kmart, and Enron. The firm later moved into more traditional consulting and employs over 1,000 workers. They were also involved in the Bernie Madoff scandal, helping the prosecution to identify 13,000 investors affected by Madoff. Let's listen to what Jay has to say about GM. For months, the news was horrific, a pounding beat of warm-up obituaries for what once had been America's greatest and most influential corporation, General Motors. At death's door, or already in the graveyard, were Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, AIG, and Citibank. The mood was apocalyptic. With car sales in a free fall from the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, GM was losing billions and running out of cash. By the time the company closed its books on 2008, it would be in the red by a staggering $30.9 billion. Chief Executive Rick Wagoner led the auto delegation in Washington, seeking government funding to save the industry and keep GM out of bankruptcy. Let's pause again to put things under perspective. Jay Alix's story starts with the 2008 global financial crisis, which caused sales to freefall and brought GM to a $31 billion loss. Looking at it this way, it's very clear why the bailout was needed. However, if we just zoom out a bit, we will also see that in the 10 years leading to 2008, GM gave its shareholders over $36 billion in dividends. That's more than the entire loss the company suffered. Had GM kept even half of these in their coffers, no bailout would be required. But why should they? Really? I mean, once GM managers realized that GM was too big to fail and that losses would be externalized to taxpayers, why shouldn't they give huge dividends in years of profit? Time, of course, proved them right, and Jay's story shows how they made it happen. Let's go back to the article, but remember that it was written at a time when the bailout was still considered a runaway success. 5 years later, after an unprecedented government equity investment, GM is thriving, and the Treasury plans to sell its remaining stake in the coming months. With countless articles and books now written about the GM restructuring and turnaround, not to mention 3 years of trumpeting by the Obama administration taking full credit for the turnaround success, the most startling aspect of the prevailing narrative is that the core of how the restructuring really happened inside GM is yet to be fully told. In the popular version of the company's turnaround story, as GM teetered toward liquidation in 2009, an Obama-appointed SWAT team, led by financier Stephen Ratner, swept in and hatched a radical plan. Through a novel use of the bankruptcy code, they would save the company by segregating and spinning out its valuable assets, while Washington furnished billions in taxpayer funds to make sure the company was viable. The real GM turnaround story, significant in saving the auto industry and the economy, is contrary to the one that has been published. In fact, the plan that was developed, implemented, and then funded by the government was devised inside GM, well before President Obama took office. In what follows, the inside story of this historic chapter in American business unfolds, laying bare the key facts. Going back a moment to my Twitter poll, most responders thought that the Obama administration came up with the idea to save GM, and Alix says here that they think so only because this was the story that the Obama administration and mainstream media wanted them to believe. Bottom line, however, it's just a story. From now on, Alix describes in detail how GM prepared the plan long before Obama even took office. Let's pause for a moment and take another look at Jay Alix, the mastermind behind GM's deal. Through founding and heading Alix Partners, Jay became a self-made billionaire. And for better or worse, he's been part of deals like GM and Kmart because he knows how to look forward, to anticipate, and advise. That's why he invests part of his wealth outside of the stock market for when conditions get rough. In fact, a groundbreaking Ernst & Young study last year revealed that 8 in 10 ultra-high net worth individuals invest in alternatives. And 40 years ago, the last time inflation was this high, one alternative in particular showed how powerful diversification can be: fine art. It had a whopping 33.2% appreciation due to its reputation as an inflation hedge, driving up demand, beating even gold. That's why Masterworks saw an opportunity to break open the market. So it wasn't just the 1% who had access. Their idea is simple. Just like you don't need to buy all of Tesla or all of Amazon to invest in these companies, you don't need to buy an entire Banksy or Picasso to invest in these paintings. Masterworks buys blue-chip paintings, securitizes them with the SEC, and enables us to buy shares in them. Investors can then trade shares in an active secondary market or wait until Masterworks sells the painting. And they've produced some incredible results, delivering 25% net returns for the last 4 years in a row, through COVID, a bear market, and scathing inflation. Past performance is no guarantee of future results, but that's pretty incredible. Because I've partnered with Masterworks, you can click on the link in the description to skip the waitlist and get access to blue-chip art investing today. Thank you, Masterworks. Now let's go back from J. Alix, the art investor, to J. Alix, the financial advisor, and hear the inside story of the GM bailout. GM's turnaround began long before GM CEO Rick Wagoner went to Washington in search of a massive loan to keep GM alive. My involvement in that story began in GM's darkest days, on Sunday, November 23, 2008, when I visited Wagoner at his home that morning, presenting a novel plan to save General Motors. As a consultant with expertise in restructurings and turnarounds, I had completed a half-dozen assignments at GM over the years. I had worked with Wagoner in 1992 when he became Chief Financial Officer. I was asked to come in for a 2-year stint as CEO of GM's national car rental, the first time GM had recruited an outsider to lead a turnaround in one of its subsidiaries. By 2008, I had over 20 years of experience with the auto industry and almost 30 years of working on turnarounds. But for the past 8 years, I had backed away from business and my firm, Alix Partners, to care for my daughters after the death of my wife. I was essentially retired. But GM's enveloping crisis and my friendship with Wagoner would bring me out. Early on that November Sunday, I called Wagoner at his home in a Detroit suburb. I asked to see him right away, explaining that I had a new idea that could help save the company. 3 hours later, I walked through his front door and into his family room. I knew Wagoner believed GM could not survive a bankruptcy. Studies showed consumer confidence would crash. No one would buy a car from a company that was bankrupt. However, what I knew about the economic crisis and GM's rapidly deteriorating liquidity position told me the company had no choice but to prepare for a bankruptcy. Yet, I agreed with Wagoner. For a global company as big and complex as GM, a normal bankruptcy would tie up the company's affairs for years, driving away customers, resulting in a tumultuous liquidation. It had happened to other companies a fraction of GM's size. It would mean the end of GM. I don't think the company will survive a bankruptcy, he told me, and no one has shown me a plan that would allow it to survive a bankruptcy. Filing bankruptcy may be inevitable, Rick, but it doesn't have to be a company-killing bankruptcy, I said. I think we can create a unique strategy that allows GM to survive bankruptcy. To be sure, my idea, sketched out on a few pages, was provocative. I knew as I pitched it to Wagoner that it might raise eyebrows, if not outright objection, from others who believed their plans would be safer. In short, I proposed that GM split into 2 very separate parts before filing. NewCo, a new company with a clean balance sheet, taking on GM's best brands and operations, and OldCo, the leftover GM with most of the liabilities. All of the operational restructuring to make the new company profitable would also occur before a bankruptcy filing, so GM could go through bankruptcy in a matter of days, not months or years with creditors and other litigants fighting over the corporate carcass while the revenue line crashes. For those unfamiliar with the bailout, clarifying that GM's plan was to split the company into 2 parts. The plan was to take everything that works and makes money into a new company and leave all the liabilities in the old company. This way the new company could start operating with government funding, profitable lines, and no debt, while the old company would be left with the debt and any other liabilities, such as getting sued for knowingly letting people die in the ignition switch scandal. With all liabilities and few assets, the old company would go bankrupt and taxpayers would foot the bill, while the new company would run forward with taxpayers giving it a good start. A pretty good deal, if you ask me. Back to the article. Seeking funding from the government or any source, we would use Bankruptcy Code Section 363, which allows a company to sell assets under a new court-approved sale. Typically, 363 is used to sell specific assets, from a chair and desk to a factory or division, but not the entire standalone company. Under this strategy, GM could postpone filing a plan of reorganization and a disclosure statement, which consume months and fuel a blizzard of litigation while market share and enterprise value bleed away. Wagoner listened, challenging every assumption. After discussing it with board members, Rick asked me to come to GM and work on the plan, one of several alternatives GM would consider. I volunteered to help GM on a pro bono basis, but what I could never anticipate was how deep and strong the opposition to my plan would ultimately be. On Tuesday, December 2nd, I pulled into GM's Detroit headquarters at 7 a.m. after most of the company's executives had already arrived for work. I was given a small cubicle and conference room on the 38th floor, a spacious but empty place that held GM's corporate boardroom, and a warren of cubicles reserved for visiting executives and board members. Each day, I would be the sole person who got off the elevator on 38, one floor down from where Wagoner and his team worked. It was eerie and quiet, the main wall lined with large oil paintings of GM's past chairmen. I'd walk past those gilded frames daily, feeling the full weight of their gaze, reminded of the history and past glory of what had been the most powerful corporation on Earth. Spending 18 hours a day digging through the numbers in GM's filings, I began working in greater detail on the outcomes of the plan and making some assumptions on what assets should be transferred to NewCo and what would stay in OldCo, which I dubbed Motors Liquidation. There were thousands of crucial questions that had to be asked and answered with management. Which brands and factories would survive? Which ones would the company have to give up? What would be the in-game strategy? What would be the enterprise value of NewCo? The liquidation value of OldCo? Wagoner and COO Fritz Henderson were developing 3 alternative plans. First, they hoped to avoid bankruptcy altogether, believing the government would provide enough funding to bring GM through the crisis. At least 2 cabinet members in the Bush administration and others had provided assurances to Rick and board members that government help would be forthcoming. Before we go on, take notice of this point. We all know how money and power tend to work together, and in this case, we see that even Republican cabinet members assure GM that the government will help GM, and General Motors would possibly be able to avoid bankruptcy altogether. Let's go back to the article, and I'll reserve any further comments to after we finish it. Second was a pre-packaged bankruptcy plan being developed by General Counsel Robert Osborne with Harvey R. Miller, the Dean of the Bankruptcy Bar and Senior Partner at Wheel, Gotchall, and Manges. Under this plan, GM would prepare a reorganization in cooperation with its bond creditors that would take effect once the company went into a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The goal of a so-called pre-pack is to shorten and simplify the bankruptcy process. Miller commanded great respect in bankruptcy circles and in the GM boardroom, and for good reason. At the age of 75, Miller was the only attorney in the country who had successfully dealt with as many high-profile bankruptcies. Miller was already in the middle of the largest corporate liquidation ever at Lehman Brothers. And third was the NewCo plan, based on years of experience at Alix Partners, where we had a major role in 50 of the 180 largest bankruptcies, over $1 billion in the past 15 years. GM had also retained Martin Bienenstock, the restructuring and corporate governance leader from Dewey and LeBoeuf, to help develop the NewCo plan as well. Inside and outside GM, the pressures mounted. Each day the company lost more money and got closer to running out of cash. In Washington, several prominent politicians began calling for Wagoner's resignation. On December 7th, Senator Chris Dodd, the Connecticut Democrat, told Face the Nation's Bob Schieffer that Wagoner had to move on. The next day I went to see Wagoner to offer encouragement and advice. It's not unusual for a CEO to lose his job when his company is forced into bankruptcy and a major restructuring. I'd seen this play out many times before, and learned the boss should never volunteer his resignation without first putting in place the things that would help the organization survive. I wanted to help fortify Rick's resolve and keep us all focused on the endgame. From my perspective, Wagoner had been unfairly treated by many politicians and the media. Since taking over as CEO in 2000, working closely with Fritz and Vice Chairman Bob Lutz, Rick orchestrated large, dramatic changes at the company. They closed GM's quality, productivity, and fuel economy gaps with the world's best automakers, winning numerous car and truck awards. They built a highly profitable business in China, the world's biggest potential car market. They reduced the company's workforce by 143,000 employees to 243,000. They reached a historic agreement with the UAW that cut in half hourly pay for new employees and significantly scaled back the traditional retiree benefit packages that had been crippling the company, while also funding over $100 billion in unfunded retiree obligations. And he was able to accomplish all these changes without causing massive disruptions among GM's dealers or major strikes with the unions. Ultimately, those structural changes positioned the company not only to survive, but also to bring about the extraordinary turnaround. But now, with the economy and the company in free fall, all that hard work seemed to be forgotten. It was late in the day on December 8th, around 5:30 p.m., when I walked into Wagoner's office. "Rick, do not resign or even offer to resign," I told him. "Later, you may have to fall on your sword to get the funding deal done with the government, but don't do it until we get the 3 things we need. If you're going to be killed on the battlefield, we need to make it worth it." "And what is that exactly?" he pressed me. "We have to get the government funding of $40 billion to $50 billion. Plus, we need an agreement with the government and GM's board to do the new co-plan, and we must put a qualified successor in place. It must be Fritz and not some government guy. It's going to be painful for you, but you've got to stay on the horse until we get all 3. Wagoner was already there. He had no intention of resigning and was determined to complete his mission. I gave him a bear hug, letting him know he had my full support. When we gathered for a telephonic board meeting on December 15th, the mood was urgent, the tension high. Only 2 weeks after arriving at GM, I was about to present the plan to the board of directors in a conference room outside Wagoner's office. Also on the phone were the company's lawyers and investment bankers. A spider phone was in the middle of the table for what would be a historic meeting of the board. Only 3 days earlier, the Senate had abandoned negotiations to provide funding for the auto industry. Suddenly, a free-fall bankruptcy within days loomed large. Consideration of the new co-plan, now refined with the help of Chief Financial Officer Ray Young and other senior finance staffers, took on greater urgency as we were just 2 weeks away from running out of cash. "I know the company has many lawyers and bankers working on other approaches," I said. "I know many of the people doing the work, and I've worked with many of them over the years. But I have an alternative strategy for the board's consideration. I suspect there might be some controversy over it, but I believe this could be life-saving for General Motors." After carefully laying out the details and time sequence of the new co-plan, I drew to a close. "Well," one director asked over the phone system, "I want to hear what Harvey Miller has to say about this. Is there a precedent for this, Mr. Miller?" Miller's deep baritone voice filled the room, pointing out that the idea was unorthodox and lacked precedence. Other attorneys chimed in, claiming the plan oversimplified the situation and there would be major problems with it. Yet another added that this would not be viewed well by the court and doubted any judge would allow it. Collectively, they characterized it as a long shot, discouraging the directors from thinking the plan could ever succeed. Hearing all the disapproving words amplifying from speakers in the ceiling, I felt ambushed by General Counsel Osborne, who was strongly advocating for a pre-packaged bankruptcy strategy, which he believed was the only way to go. Unbeknownst to me, he had previously proposed this idea to GM's board, naively believing GM could complete a pre-pack bankruptcy in 30 days. GM's most senior leaders had been working with me on the new co-plan around the clock. I felt strongly this alternative approach could succeed, and I knew that any other type of Chapter 11 strategy would kill vehicle sales and lead to the demise of GM. Now it seemed as if the new co-plan could be dead on arrival. "If the attorneys feel this is a waste of time and corporate resources, I don't know why we would pursue this," stated another director. A chilling silence descended upon the room, broken by Kent Kresa, the former CEO of Northrop Grumman and a GM board member since 2003. "I understand this has some risk attached to it, but we're in a very risky state right now," he said, And I understand it may even be unusual and unprecedented, but it's certainly creative, and quite frankly, it's the most innovative idea we've heard so far that has real potential in it. I think it deserves further consideration and development." Rick then addressed another lawyer on the call, Martin Bienenstock. "Well, I've actually studied the problem too, and there's a way for this to work," said Bienenstock. "Almost all bankruptcies are unique, and the code does allow for the transfer of assets. I can't imagine a judge taking on this problem and not wanting to solve it. We've done a preliminary analysis, and it's not as crazy as it sounds. It's unique and compelling." "Okay, we've heard both sides of it," Rick said after others spoke, smartly bringing the debate to a reasonable close. "I suggest we continue working to develop both the pre-pack plan and the NewCo option, while seeking the funding to avoid Chapter 11 if at all possible." The meeting adjourned without a vote. I left the room disappointed to hear Osborne's legal chorus so dead set against NewCo, and surprised their remarks had stopped all real discussion of the plan. But I was also relieved the plan was not completely dead, at least not yet. Over the next weeks, I worked closely with Bienenstock, Assistant General Counsel Mike Milliken, Al Koch of Alix Partners, and GM Senior Vice President John Smith on the NewCo plan. We huddled dozens of times with Wagoner and Henderson to work out which brands GM would ultimately have to give up, Hummer, Saturn, Saab, and Pontiac, and which ones it would keep, Chevrolet, Cadillac, GMC, and Buick. Informed debate and deep analysis of structural costs led to decisions about projects, factories, brands, and countries. On Sunday afternoon, March 29th, Wagoner called me. It was a call I had hoped would never come, but here it was. "Jay," he said, "I wanted to give you a heads up. The administration wants me to step aside. The president is going to hold a press conference tomorrow morning." Wagoner told me Henderson would be named CEO. "What about the bankruptcy?" I asked. "They're enamored with the NewCo plan. They seem bound and determined to make us file Chapter 11 and do NewCo. This is really tough," he said. "I'm so sorry," I said, pausing, "but you got the money. They're doing the NewCo plan, and Fritz is your successor. You've succeeded. You got the three things." Rick responded with resigned acknowledgement, then said, "Please help Fritz in any way you can," before hanging up. Rick's personal sacrifice was not in vain. Months of hard work had paid off. The assets and liabilities had been selected. The NewCo legal entities and $45 billion tax loss strategy had been developed. The strategy I pitched to Wagoner in his living room 4.5 months earlier was the plan chosen by Team Otto in a meeting on April 3, 2009 in Washington. Treasury agreed to fully fund NewCo with equity, and thus it became the chosen path to save the company. By late April, NewCo implementation was well underway. The bankruptcy filing would occur in New York within weeks. My partner, Al Koch of Alix Partners, would become the Chief Restructuring Officer, running Oldco, now officially named Motors Liquidation, Inc. In my notes, I jotted, "My work is finished. Impact from this day forward will be negligible. Treasury's in control. Time to get back to my girls." On June 1, 2009, General Motors filed for bankruptcy in New York with $82 billion in assets and $173 billion in liabilities. It was the largest industrial bankruptcy in history. Harvey Miller and his team masterfully defended and guided the NewCo plan through the bankruptcy court, successfully making it their own. New GM exited bankruptcy protection on July 10, 2009, in a mere 40 days, as designed. Fritz called and thanked me. There would be many other twists and turns to GM's narrative, but the company got its fresh start using the NewCo plan, and the industry was saved with government funding from both Presidents Bush and Obama. In March 2009, President Obama cited a failure of leadership as his reason for forcing out Wagoner. In fact, it was Wagoner's exercise of leadership through years of wrenching change, and then simultaneously seeking government funding while developing 3 restructuring plans that put GM in position to survive the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression and complete its turnaround, which ironically became a key campaign issue in the re-election of Barack Obama in 2012. So, how does all this fit with my How GM Sold America video series? I'll start with an easy one, Rick Wagoner. Wagoner paid the price of GM's bankruptcy and lost his job as CEO of General Motors. But I have to agree with the author. He wasn't the one at fault. In truth, Wagoner performed major changes in GM, both previously under CEO Roger Smith and as General Motors' CEO. Under Wagoner's reign, quality climbed considerably. The cars became more technologically advanced and more appealing for buyers. So Wagoner was good at making better products that buyers would want to buy without rebates, but he was also better than his predecessors in guarding the war chest. As I mentioned, between the years 1997 and 2007, GM squandered $36 billion as dividends. That's a huge pile of money that could have saved GM from going bankrupt, but almost two-thirds of that were given in the 3 years prior to Wagoner taking office, and only one-third in the 8 years that he was in charge. The $36 billion given in dividends go well with another point in Alix's article. As I previously said, the scope of this article comfortably starts with GM being in huge debt and trying to find a way out, but what Alix left out is how that debt was created. As shown in Part 3 of my GM trilogy, link in card above, despite taking hundreds of millions in subsidies in the years leading to the bailout, GM withdrew $37 billion from the company's war chest and gave them as dividends to shareholders. Judging GM as a corporation, it failed miserably. But if judged as a money pump designed for pumping money from the pockets of taxpayers around the world into those of GM shareholders, it was in fact a huge success. I see several moral errors in GM's operations before and after the bailout, and they are glaring. The first moral error is that GM constantly took huge subsidies around the world. Under pure capitalism, there is no room for subsidies, except when trying to break monopolies, which was not the case for GM. I'm a bit more lenient on that, and do see room for subsidies in specific situations, but GM made this its constant way of operation. The second moral error is that if taking funds from taxpayers, they should be carefully invested to advance manufacturing and product technology and make the company sustainably profitable. Instead, GM constantly underinvested in its operations outside China and kept them non-viable without further subsidies. Once subsidies stopped, GM closed Holden as well as other global operations, sold Vauxhall and Opel to Stellantis, and closed many American factories. Sure, GM could show a case that these factories were not sustainable, but just like with Alix starting the article with the debt and not how it was accumulated, GM failed to show that the factories became unsustainable through GM underinvesting and pulling profits away from those that were profitable. The third moral error is that some of those allegedly unprofitable plants and subsidiaries were in fact profitable, but shown as unviable through transfer pricing. This enabled GM to keep on taking subsidies while avoiding local taxes. The fourth moral error is that if taxpayer funds are taken despite all that, they should not find their way into shareholder pockets. But this was exactly what GM did. Throughout the years, it took billions of dollars in subsidies worldwide, but paid even more in shareholder dividends. This means that in most years, every single dollar of subsidies GM received was taken by GM's owners, instead of invested in the company or kept in its war chest for times of trouble. And the fifth, huge moral error, is that the bailout taught GM that all the above was indeed fine. That it's okay to take subsidies, underinvest, and empty the company's coffers, because if the shit hits the fan, the government would pay. Going back to that wonderful sentence by CB, GM turned into a quasi-nationalized company, in which their profits are kept, but their losses are socialized and charged to taxpayers in the form of bailouts and subsidies. And as big as it is, this moral error is eclipsed by the sixth, which was GM's repaying the subsidies and bailout with closing of plants, which could have been saved. GM was trigger-happy in closing factories, citing that this is how capitalism works. If U.S., Australian, European, or Thai production is more expensive than making the cars in China, the company has an obligation to its shareholders to close other operations and move production to China. While I agree that's capitalism, and normally I'd be for it, I find it hard to justify citing capitalism in these cases, while fully ignoring it when sucking taxpayer money is possible. Capitalism would have meant not taking any subsidies. Capitalism would have also meant leaving GM to die without bailing it out. Subsidies and bailouts are anything but capitalism, and these favors should be returned with loyalty to those taxpayers, social responsibility to the communities, and investing in factories to make them viable instead of sucking subsidies till they are dry and then building in China. And I do mean building in China. As shown in the third video in my series, it seems as if GM planned to move all car production and all EV production to China and export from there to the entire world, USA included. GM started this with importing the Buick Envision to America from China. From 2017 to this day, the Envision is the best-selling Chinese car in America, with few buyers being aware of its Chinese origins. GM also did this with the Cadillac CTS PHEV and planned to do it with additional cars, except that import tariffs arrived and thwarted their plans. In my opinion, this also forced GM to start building Factory Zero to start making EVs in the USA instead of importing all EVs from China as previously planned. A seventh moral error is GM's constant meddling with politics. They constantly fight tightening of emissions regulations. They constantly fought safety regulations, as far back as the safety belt, despite knowing it would save lives, and they bitterly fought against the import tariffs. GM was the largest importer of Chinese cars to America, and these tariffs were a huge hurdle in GM's plan to import even more cars from China. GM heavily employed lobbying firms, donated to political campaigns, and was heavily involved in determining regulations, subsidies, and legislation. I cannot stress this enough. GM uses capitalism as its excuse for moving production to China, but all this meddling in politics is diametrically opposed to capitalism. As profitable as meddling with politics proved for GM, as seen through the numerous subsidies and huge bailout, this is morally wrong. And don't laugh, but the eighth moral error was GM hiding all this from the public. GM hid all the meddling and political give and take. They hid the fact that the bailout was their creation, not Obama's or G.W. Bush's. It's not that I'm naive enough to expect them to show transparency in places where they act dirty, but I do see this as something very wrong and a huge moral error. It's pretty clear to me that many of those who supported the deal, thinking the government came up with it and forced GM's CEO to resign, would have been much less supportive had they known that the deal was in fact GM's idea, that the new CEO, Fritz Henderson, considered Wagoner as his mentor, and that he was in fact GM's choice for replacing Wagoner. Such things matter when assessing huge deals signed on taxpayers' behalf, and GM, as well as the new administration, made sure to hide these from public eyes. Going back to the fifth moral error, capitalism tells us that failed companies should not be helped, because rewarding mismanagement only teaches them that doing so is fine, and that war chests can happily be raided, because whatever happens, there's always someone else to foot the bill. However, when I said before that the bailout taught GM that working the way they did was fine, and that any losses would be externalized to the public, I did not mean this theoretically. There is hard proof showing that this in fact happened. Consider the following points. To this day, GM is taking hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies. For example, in 2021, Tesla made 500,000 cars in America and took $0 in subsidies. Toyota made 1.6 million cars per year in America and took $1.8 million in subsidies. And GM sold 2.2 million cars per year in America, yet took $170 million in subsidies. I didn't find U.S. production numbers for GM, only sales numbers. And while GM exports some cars from America, it also imports others from China, Korea, and mostly Canada and Mexico. So production should be of the same order of magnitude. And whichever way you put it, it is beyond me why GM should get almost 100 times what Toyota got in subsidies, both being public companies owned by people all over the world and making a similar number of cars in the USA. And 2021 was a slow year. In 2019 and 2020 combined, GM took over $1 billion in taxpayer dollars, and this year it also signed a deal with the state of Michigan for another $4 billion in subsidies. To put this under perspective, that's more than $1,000 gifted to GM from each Michigander household. And just like before the bailout, GM is still handing out to its shareholders hefty dividends. Once again, it's like all subsidies end up in shareholder pockets, especially so with GM's largest private shareholder, Mary Barra. Note that I wouldn't have said anything against the dividends and Barra owning so many shares had they not fed on taxpayer dollars so hungrily. If you ask me, taking money from taxpayers and funneling it to shareholder and management pockets is plain wrong. And it's not like these subsidies are the government's idea, with GM just benefiting from them along with the rest of the companies. You know the $7,500 EV tax credit? It was GM that lobbied for that subsidy, while other automakers only receive it because it's there, and that's just one of numerous examples. In short, just like before the bailout, GM still meddles with politics, legislation, and regulation. They still receive billions of dollars in subsidies, and they still funnel them to shareholder pockets as huge dividends. Capitalism is right on this account, as bailing a failed company out rewards them for their bad practices, and thus teaches management what they did was right, and they should keep on doing the same. You and I will pay. And we always pay. You know how Alix said he arranged the deal for GM pro bono as his way of helping American industry survive? He didn't lie there. He did this work free. GM didn't pay him a dime. However, is it by chance that once the deal was up and running, GM chose his firm, Alix Partners, for the extremely profitable business of overseeing the restructuring and the selling of old GM's assets? I think not. Tell me what you think. As I said, GM played both sides of the house, and despite each party signing a different tune to their voters, bottom line was that both Democrats and Republicans had GM's back. It's very clear that the Democrats and the Obama administration arranged to bail GM out. But how about Republicans? For starters, remember this line that Alix said. At least 2 cabinet members in the Bush administration and others had provided assurances to Rick and board members that government help would be forthcoming. So Republicans assured GM brass that government would help arrive and possibly save them from bankruptcy altogether. But the Bush administration was on its way out. It would take time for Obama to seize control, and GM needed money fast. So on December 19, 2008, a week after Republicans in the Senate had killed a bailout bill proposed by Democrats, saying it didn't impose big enough wage cuts on the UAW, Bush unilaterally agreed to lend $17.4 billion of taxpayers' money to General Motors and Chrysler, of which $13.4 billion was to be extended immediately. He had to twist the law to get the money. Deprived of congressional funding, he diverted cash from the loathed TARP program, which Congress had already passed, but which was supposed to be restricted to rescuing the banks. Bush later explained the move, saying, "I didn't want there to be 21% unemployment. I didn't want history to look back and say, Bush could have done something but chose not to do it." I could go on showing how even Mitt Romney, who publicly opposed saving GM, would have in fact bailed GM out had he won instead of Obama, but I'll wait with that. The reason is that while going down this rabbit hole, I found power plays so huge that compared to them, everything I showed so far about GM seems almost innocent. These power plays and their method of operation involve GM, Democrats, Republicans, and POTUS. They utilize lobbying firms, mainstream media, and use unsuspecting citizens as extras in a show designed to milk taxpayers of hard-earned dollars while making them think it's the right thing to do. I have tons of proof to back me up, but all this deserves a separate video, so sign up and hit the bell icon for a heads up when that video is out. I have yet to write the script for it, but from the evidence that I have, all I can tell you is that it should be exciting. If till now I thought that GM used politicians as pawns in its game, it turns out that at times, GM itself also served as pawn in a much larger game. It practically blew my mind to find out the layers of corruption and powers operating in politics. You see a layer and it's rotten, and you're sure that's where the stink comes from, but then you dig in and find out that's only a cover hiding a much greater stench. Meanwhile, back to Alix and the story of the bailout. I wonder, does knowing that GM arranged the bailout and got politicians to push it through change your view on the bailout? Do you support the subsidies it's getting nowadays, which are 100 times what Toyota USA is getting? Is it okay for them to take subsidies while also giving dividends to its managers and shareholders? And would you support a future bailout if GM needs it in upcoming years? Let me know below what you think. In a moment, we'll hear Barra explaining why GM donates to politicians, so don't go away. A huge shout out to my latest patrons, David C., Dave Martin, and Adrian Sass. And to all my patrons, you guys rock. You can follow me on Twitter, where I am Connecting No Dots. Until next time, I am connecting the dots, and you are amazing. And now, here's Barra explaining why GM donates to politicians.
Let me ask you about political funding, because it's an issue that a lot of people are focused on. And as following the January 6th riots on Capitol Hill, you know this, GM was one of the many corporations that put a pause on political funding. But you have restarted that funding, and in some cases have made donations to some of the Republican members of Congress who had voted against certifying the Biden election. Can you explain that decision?
So we look at, we don't agree with everyone. We give it to both parties,
right.
And we don't necessarily, a PAC donation is not necessarily an endorsement of every single thing that person has done. And so, but we do look on balance. We've added additional requirements of what we're looking for since that time. And, we'll stand behind the decisions. We have a committee that looks at that, so it's cross-functional, it's debated. And we think it's also important, though, at times to have that influence. And so we'll continue to be very measured and make sure we're also, as we go forward, consistent
right.
with our values.
What do you think of not spending any money in Washington? Would you ever say to yourself, you know what, I mean, here you are, and you're going to be running the business roundtable, but what do you think of the idea of just saying, you know what, let's get money out of this, we're not going to do it?
I think those are easy things to say. The unintended consequences and how it really turns out, I think, are what most people don't understand. Believe me, we've had those discussions at General Motors.
And what's the?
Well, we on balance made the decision that in a very measured way, looking at what we do consistent with our values, we thought it was in the best interest for the company right. And for our all of our stakeholders that we have a voice.
Mary knows what she's talking about. Only those that pay have a say, while you and I are sold stories right and left as we go on funding this never-ending party. That's how things work, I know. But to be honest, this makes me sad.